Yes. Okay, great. So I will begin. Thank you and welcome everybody to the spring 2023 Sara Little Turnbull Visiting Designer Lecture Series. If you've been to one of these before, you know what we do. We talk to various luminaries in the worlds of design, art, the sciences, activism, and sometimes even farther afield. This semester, we will be focusing on design specifically through a queer lens. And that means queer representation in the design industry, how the products of that industry include queer and non-binary users and audiences. And this, I should also mention, this series is running concurrently with the Lehman College Art Gallery's current exhibition. It's up right now. It's called Queer Love, Affection and Romance in Contemporary Art. It presents paintings and photographs that illuminate both individual and universal stories of vulnerability, tenderness, and desire in the LGBTQIA+ community. It actually opened on Valentine's Day, and it closes on April 28th. This, I also should mention, this lecture series is a direct component of a interdisciplinary course that focuses on LGBTQIA+ issues in design. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about is going to be tangential to what's going on in this class that I'm not teaching, by the way, but they are here, the professor is here. And I really do hope that students feel comfortable asking questions using the Q&A module that you'll see at the very bottom of your screen on Zoom. Just feel free to pop in any questions that come into mind as we're talking today. And also this lecture series, as in the past, is open to the public. So anyone who's here with a keyboard is able to ask questions about what we're talking about. Before I introduce our guest, I just wanted to thank Dorothy Dunn at the Turnbull Foundation for her help, her continued help, and the foundation's continued generosity in support of the design program and the art department proper and Lehman in general. It's been very key in these last couple of years because it allows us to talk about the things we're talking about today, which, normally we don't have the bandwidth for, I guess, or, there's other things that we're working on and that we have to divert resources to. So it's really an honor to be able to talk about these issues in such a theoretical way, and then kind of bring it into the classroom. It's pretty amazing. So thank you. And now our guest. So with me today is Professor Colleen Macklin. She is a game designer. She's an associate professor in the School of Art, Media and Technology at Parsons School of Design, which is my alma mater. Which is where I met her. She's interested in how games model and reveal ideologies or systems. At Parsons, she's the founder and co-director of Pet Lab, or PET Lab or Pet Lab. Is that Pet Lab?
We call it Pet Lab, yeah.
Cool. I'll call it Pet Lab. A design research lab that develops games for experimental learning and social engagement. Pet Lab projects include disaster preparedness games and sports with the Red Cross, the urban activist game Reactivism, and the fiscal sport Budget Ball. She is a member of the game design collective Local Number 12, known for the video game Dear Reader, and the social card game, the Metagame. She has co-authored with John Sharp, Games Design and Play, a detailed look at iterative game design, and Iterate, 10 Lessons in Design and Failure, that's at MIT Press. She's also a lot of fun and just makes classrooms very engaging spaces. So welcome, Colleen. Thank you so much for taking your time out of your day to be with us.
I am so excited to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation. Yeah, I mean, I have to say that, I'll talk a little bit about some of my creative work, but really so much of my life is about education and about, creating inclusive spaces for folks to learn about stuff. So, all I want to say as I'm showing some of this stuff is if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I really, I love being interactive. So it's totally cool if something's unclear and you want a little more on that. But this should be short, and then maybe we can kind of spend most of our time discussing some of the different issues related to games, because that is kind of my space. So hopefully you can see this
Yep.
little
Yeah.
title screen here, Queering Games. So, and David, if you let me know if somebody in the chat is posting something, it's a little
Yeah.
hard. Oh,
Yeah.
never mind. I can.
And I'll field that too. Like, I can kind of
Yeah.
manage that. And if I see questions that are pertinent, I'll interrupt you and throw them out, and we can talk about them. So again, everybody, if you have a question,
Awesome.
it's totally fine to answer it.
Yeah.
Ask it whenever. It's fine.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. All right. So just briefly, I think about queering games. There's so many different kind of places where that might happen. I think a lot of people consider representation, meaning the kinds of characters and the stories and relationships that are enabled in games as a big part of it. Another big part of it is just sort of approaching design as a queer person. I identify as non-binary and also in a same-sex marriage. So, I kind of live as someone who is sort of identifies as queer. But my work doesn't really kind of express that as much as you might think. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that too, because I'm really interested, as David mentioned, in systems. And I think systemic oppression is real. It's hard to see though. And so a big part of what I try to do is understand systems through games. So we'll go quickly through some samples of work that'll hopefully help you understand what I mean when I say systems. So these are some kind of more recent projects, I would say, within the realm of games, and we're going to go through each one of these, so I'm not going to dwell on them, but they really range from everything like a video game on a phone, a 3D immersive game, and also sports and card games and other kinds of activities that you might not even imagine as games. So I'm really interested in pushing the boundaries of what we mean when we talk about games and really emphasizing play, because play is where the good stuff happens.
Yeah.
But I started as a photographer. Here are some photographs that I took when I was in high school. I attended an afternoon program. It was called a career center. It was there to train you for a career in the arts. And we learned wedding photography and all kinds of really important money-making skills. But also I got to explore fine arts photography. And that really kind of captured my interest and excitement. And these are photographs of my grandmother who raised me. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. So a little different from New York City. But I really had a great upbringing. I'm really glad that my grandparents were able to raise me. And as you can see here, they also, my grandmother was very tolerant of my photography and would pose in all kinds of funny outfits and things for me to take pictures. Yeah.
I never knew that. This is an amazing angle on you, so to speak. Wow.
Yeah, and the house I grew up in is in the background of the two pictures on the upper right. So just a real simple, very generic, what you imagine when you imagine American suburbs. Even though I was kind of a weird kid. I was not out at this time. It took me until moving to New York City to finally feel comfortable, publicly being gay. But ever since I can remember, I've been gay. So then, that's some work. And then while I was in college and then afterwards, I started doing weird stuff with other visuals. So my photography transformed into more interactive work. These are two examples. They probably look kind of like a little bit low frame rate, but that's because these pieces were created on old computers from the 1990s. And I was doing visuals at rave parties in New York City. So I kind of found a cool group of people who wanted to play with technology and play with ideas, but also with music. And that was a really formative moment for me. But, you can't just make visuals at rave parties. So at the same time, I worked in advertising, and I did the programming, not the visual design, for this particular game, quote unquote, which was really a game where you mixed different cocktails with a liqueur called Midori, which is a melon
Sure.
liqueur.
Sure.
Pro
Yeah.
tip, don't drink a lot of Midori liqueur. You will not feel
Yeah.
good the next day.
A little bit goes a long way. Yeah. That's
Right.
correct.
It's
Yeah.
delicious, but too much and you'll
Yeah.
regret it. So this really, I was learning programming, kind of on my own. I taught myself, and I wish that, I went to school for photography in Brooklyn. I went to Pratt Institute. And I never really learned how to program there. I just kind of like did it on my own a little bit. And, I was really lucky that I had a computer and I could teach myself. But this is all to say that if you're interested in doing something, just pick it up and try it. There's so many great resources out there. You can learn to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't have to. And school's good for you. It's good that you're in school.
Yeah.
But, it's not the end of your learning.
Right. Right.
And then, I started working at Parsons as a part-time faculty member. And then the president of the university asked me to do a project. And of course, I couldn't say no. And it was a project about the Electoral College, which oh my gosh. So he wanted me to make a game that would introduce young folks to how the Electoral College worked. What a compelling and exciting topic.
Yeah. Wow.
About the Electoral College.
Yeah.
But
although a little bit of knowledge about that would have helped out in 2020 for sure.
I know. It's so very true. And you can see the year here is 2004.
Nothing's changed. Yeah,
I think that was an election too that was really the Electoral College vote won it, but not the popular vote. So, it's a weird system in the United States. And system is the key word here. So
system's the word.
When I was asked to make this game, I didn't really know what I was doing. Of course, I'd made this Midori thing, but that was the extent of my experience making games. And so I pulled together a group of amazing students, and we sat down and we were like, oh my God, how do we make a game out of the Electoral College that people will like? And we made a prototype that I thought was pretty good, that you cannot play the game now. It's it was in Flash and we never updated it. But here's a little video. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but basically the gameplay put you, player versus player. One player is a Republican presidential candidate, the other's the Democratic candidate. And what you would do is pick certain issues to play in states in order to win the electoral votes. And so you had to strategize. Where are you going to campaign? The only states worth campaigning are the states where you might get electoral votes and you might get the most electoral votes. So we quickly learned as we built this that the Electoral College is a broken game. It actually is kind of a broken system. It creates the problems that we experience with certain elections. And the big lesson out of this is that in order to really understand, I believe, many things about modern life, you have to start with the system. And it just so happens that with games, that's what you have to do too. What is the system that you're making? And just briefly, if you haven't really kind of delved into systems theory, I won't blame you, but I will plug this great book, Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. She really does a great job defining systems and why they're interesting. She basically says a system is an interconnected set of elements that's coherently organized in a way that achieves something. And if you think about it, the economy is a system. We have natural systems. Climate change is systemic. We have, increases in greenhouse gases, and the relationships between these elements create those outcomes. Even, racism, we use the term systemic racism to fully understand how it's deeply embedded in rules and laws in this country, as well as the way that housing and other things are distributed. So it really is, it really is kind of everything. Here's like just a few systems that you might consider either making games about or delving into more deeply. But the cool thing about that electoral college project that I learned is that even if it's a kind of a boring topic like the electoral college, you can make a game about it, make it compelling, and show how that system really works or doesn't in the real world. And I'll be honest, I didn't really understand the electoral college. It's not like I was some kind of expert. I just knew how to make games. But by making that game, I felt like I had such a deeper insight into how something in our country works. So I encourage you, if you're not sure how something works, make a game about it. You'll have to kind of get in there at the systems level. So that really spawned Pet Lab, which David mentioned earlier, a research lab where we focus on play and games for learning and social change. And we've done a bunch of different projects, a few such as reactivism, take moments of activism in New York City and players reenact them in order to learn how those activist moments happened and also where they did. They reenact them in the locations where they happened. This is, wow, I think, a card for the Stonewall riots, which kind of sparked the gay rights movement in 1969.
Right.
And so, these are all really important moments in history. But what is it like when you actually stand on that corner and you sing the song that was sung at the protest that day? Does it give you a better understanding or empathy for what was, what kind of rights were hard won through protest? Mm-hmm. And so the game kind of looks like, people doing weird stuff on the sidewalk. Wow. And we learned a lot over the course of that project about how to run games in the city and be safe and make sure that everyone feels comfortable and safe. I can talk more about that later. Or we also designed a sport about the federal debt. So here you go, another really scintillating topic that you just can't wait to get your hands on. This game was called Budget Ball, and we played it in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall, which is kind of the backyard of the White House. And it was a sport. We had students from colleges all around the nation converge on this spot for a few days for a tournament, and they played against congressional members of the budget committee and other politicians. I'm going to give you one guess. Who won, the college teams or our representatives in national government?
Well, I mean, my initial guess is the students, just because they're more live and they're healthier and they don't sit in the lower chamber. Just but at the other, I mean, you play with us. You're always like gaming the system. So I'm going to go with choice B, that the congressional representatives actually won. Am I right?
I think your first instinct was the right one, David.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the college students, just basically based on physical fitness, were able to run.
That's all it is.
Yeah. But it's pretty cool because it's a sport that you actually not only just kind of play, but here you see a picture of one of the players holding an egg in an oven mitt. What's that about? Well, the sport during every period before each quarter involved teams strategizing about buying power-ups for their team. So that could be an individual player, or it could be like someone who gets 3 points instead of 2 points. And it's a simple sport where you're just kind of running the ball into the end zone. You're not allowed to tackle. It's kind of a lightweight sport. There's no like heavy duty stuff. But then if you buy advantages for your team, you go into debt and there's interest, and you have to pay off those advantages by taking sacrifices. And having enough players wear oven mitts and carry eggs is one of the sacrifices of paying off.
But there's actually a comment here in the Q&A, which I thought maybe it's kind of interesting, that the students didn't play with pre-assumptions about things, right? In other words, very little ideology went into they are seeing a new game and they're reassessing it based on the game system itself. Whereas when congressional leaders sit down, we just saw this in January, when they sit down in the lower chamber of the House, they're coming with lots of ideological baggage that's going to delay so many things. So that's another thing, is like, and we could talk about this after you're done, but in terms of systems and the systems we live with assumptions or presuppositions about those systems. And that's another thing games are really great at doing. They can allow us to interrogate those assumptions, not just the system itself, but our assumptions about it, that self-reflexive thing, in order to win. Like, you have to win. So in order to achieve the victory conditions, you need to sort of drop all that stuff. And I find that fascinating, but let's continue. This is very cool.
No, I totally agree, David, because, and hi, Dorothy. When Dorothy Dunn was at the Philip Johnson Glass House, Pet Lab came and made a game there about inhabiting different stakeholders and what sort of housing materials and sustainability stories we could tell there. So yeah, I mean, it's so good to see you. Right. Yeah, it's totally true. And also, I think we tell ourselves stories that get away from the way things actually work. And if we can understand how things actually work, we have a better story to tell. We're so much better at understanding the world. Maybe that's a good way to come together. So this, we have divided.
Well, so that's an interesting comment, though. Our stories versus games. Games have what I was reading some of the things you suggested I read, and one of the big things I noticed was that there is one of the things high-level game critique kind of relies on and looks at is the disconnect between the mechanics of a game and then the narrative of the game, right? The Ludo narratology, I think, is the terminology for it. And
so fancy. Yeah,
it's really fancy, but it's basically like when you're playing poker, it's an abstract game of cards and symbols. It has nothing to do with whatever, like if you're playing solitaire or some kind of like poker game that involves cards, there might be an implied narrative, but it has nothing to do with the symbolism of the game and everything. But there are other games where the narrative is very much connected to the mechanics. And I find that kind of interesting. And maybe that's the case. I mean, there are stories in games all the time. Maybe it's just that how stories are created and how they're expressed through games doesn't necessarily relate very well to the actual game mechanics itself. The structure of the system that the game is sort of made upon. I just thought that's another thing. We can talk about it later, but it's just occurring to me.
Let's definitely talk. Yeah, let's talk about stories and systems, because they're two different things. But they connect, they're connected. And we'll definitely focus on that, because I think that also gets at the heart of LGBTQ representation in games.
Absolutely.
Is it the story that we're telling? Is it through the character design and through the narrative elements like the dialogue, or is it about the systems that we're designing that are more inclusive, or maybe there's so many ways to think about it. I think it's all of those things. But we can create a framework to think about it that way. So just wrapping up some Pet Lab work, the final kind of, we spent almost a decade working with the Red Cross, International Red Cross, as well as the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. And they are interested in how we can work with local communities to set priorities, to be better prepared for climate change. And this is an image of me in Uganda learning a game that the community plays, from childhood on up. We all have these traditional games from our own cultures. And this was one that I was learning. And then we'll take these games and we'll actually try to integrate some of the community's needs and how climate change is affecting the community. So that was a really nice and very long project. And I really had the privilege of meeting people all over the world and learning all kinds of games to be able to think about these issues. So that closes on Pet Lab. And then I make games for fun too. They're not always about the Electoral College or climate change. This is a card game called the Metagame, and it is basically a way of talking about contemporary culture, design, art, you name it, from PowerPoint to the weird phenomenon of brunch. We can debate which has the most empty calories. I hope my PowerPoint doesn't have too many empty calories, but sometimes they do. So that's a meta game. And then Dear Reader is our most recent game. It's an iPhone game. It's available on Apple Arcade, which is their subscription service. And you can play through classic literature in this game as a series of word puzzles. And what I'll say about this, and in terms of LGBTQ content, actually with both of these games, I always make sure that there's stuff in there that at least speaks to broad audiences. So with Dear Reader, for instance, there's over 100 books, but they're not all written by white cis authors. We have books about queer identity in life, and we have books written by Black authors, books written by authors from the Middle East, from China, from all over the world. As long as they're in the public domain, we can't use contemporary stuff because most of that's copyrighted. We include it. So here you'll see a book by Ziktala Sa that is about the Native American experience, and also Arctique next to it is a book about like a feminist utopia. So there's all kinds of stuff in here that you might discover that you'd never heard of before. And that's part of the goal that I have in design, is just, trying to integrate as much diversity as we can into the things that we're including. And then, just briefly, a recent project is a project that I'm currently working on called Cloud Theory. This might look more like a traditional video game because it's 3D and it looks realistic. And it is to some degree. But in this game, you just hang out and you look at clouds and they take shapes of different things. That's a poodle. And you talk with an AI, just like ChatGPT. It's actually a GPT-based AI about what you see in the shape. And it's sort of poetry. It's sort of weird. It's not, it pushes against what we think of as video games a little. But that's a personal project that I'm working on right now. And I'm really excited because I feel like my career has moved from very commercial work, like the Midori game, to expressive stuff around the rave, visuals I was doing, to very applied educational projects around Pet Lab. And now I get to kind of just have fun too, making games that I'm excited.
This kind of, the thing that pops out in my mind when I'm looking at this game is Backrooms. Have you heard about Backrooms?
No.
So Backrooms is a very bizarre, I'm not even sure how to describe it. And it's more like in the realm of like creepypasta, internet meme world. It's a game where you get dropped into miles and miles of hallways that look like the basement of like a 1990s Macy's or Sears or something like that. And it's all empty and barren, and you walk through the mindless halls, and then eventually something starts chasing you. You can hear like audible cues that something's
that sounds like a nightmare.
It's very creepy. It's very creepy, but that's the creepy to this very placid experience that this I can see being very appropriate for children as children's media, of course. But I could also see it could have like a life on like Steam or something like that, where people play it just because it is like it's a calming experience. Like there's I think there's space for that in games. So there isn't clear victory conditions, and a whole culture kind of emerges out of that, I think, which is interesting. We're in that weird time where that can happen with games.
I agree. The interesting thing about this particular game is that you never know what the machine learning algorithm will say.
Right.
It says something a little bit different every time. Now, I have trained the algorithm to not hopefully be evil, but as we know, a lot of these machine learning algorithms have bias within them, right? So I've fed it, so to speak, texts and writing that I think will hopefully, teach it to say more interesting things and less
Yeah.
biased things. I've even worked to remove gender pronouns from pieces of literature to train it with old philosophical texts, but instead of saying man or
Yeah.
mankind, human or humankind.
Well, it's got
So
a lot
I'm
of work
really
to do there.
yeah, and it's not, if you play the game, you may not even notice that, but to me as the
Right.
designer, it's really important. And those are the little hidden things that you just don't even think about when you're playing games.
So, well, I mean, this kind of brings us to, since we're ending on this, are we ending on this Chat GPT
I was just gonna,
Okay.
I was just gonna say,
Yes.
I make games, but I write about them too. So these 3 books, so Games, Design, and Play, Iterate, are books I've co-authored with my colleague John Sharp, who I teach with and also co-directs Pet Lab. And they're really about the process of game design, but we interview and include very diverse and intersectional artists and designers. It's really important to us also to have that kind of form of inclusion, to give voice to different practitioners. And then queer game studies, I just have a chapter in this. It was co-edited by Bonnie Ruberg and Adrian Shaw. But it is a thing I'm really interested in on a theoretical level as well as a practical one. And I wanted to just kind of end with a quote from Bonnie Ruberg's other book, Video Games Have Always Been Queer. I know I shouldn't include tons of text and read it, as it can be.
That's okay.
That's okay. But I'll paraphrase it. Let's just say that. I think the really big revelation with Bonnie Ruberg's research and this book is that even games that appear to have no LGBTQ storylines or content can be viewed queerly, can be played queerly. The exciting thing to me about games is that as players, we take them up and we make choices about how we want to approach them and play them, that they have open-ended aspects to them as systems that are, lead to all kinds of different outcomes. And the stories we tell about our game playing experiences also come through our own experiences and identities. So that really is about, the fact that, as Ruberg says here, queerness and video games share a common ethos, the longing to imagine alternative ways of being and make space within structures of power for resistance through play. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah,
and open
I mean,
it up
that's a really, I love that. And that's actually one of the things I wanted to talk about, is this idea that games, and I didn't know this until recently, talking to queer and non-binary students of mine who play a lot more video games than I do, and they occupy these spaces far more than I ever have or ever will. I'm like a Gen X, old school, Nintendo.
You can do it, David. You can pick up some games. I'll take some games to play.
I mean, we're talking like at this point, like Halo and GoldenEye, like 90s Super Mario Brothers 3. That's like where, yeah. Give me a game playlist, because I love games. I love system design, and we're going to talk about that. But I'm just not in that world. Plus, I have kids, and they play Minecraft, and Roblox is like another one where there's they're online communities, and I don't know. It's just something that I'm not sort of acclimated to. However, talking to my students, they clued me into the fact that some of their deepest relationships are in these online spaces where they inhabit a kind of avatar or a character, and their friends do as well, and they can kind of be and feel an experience and create stories and narratives, right? Because that's partly, as we said, what gaming is about. And experience these games and experiences together, these stories and experiences together with people who they may never meet in the meat space, right? In the physical world. And it gives them a space to do that, that's beautiful and completely digital and very, very important to them. And that's something that's new to me. Like I guess I always thought about games as being escapist, and You know, and it's like, it's fun to pretend and inhabit the story, and try strategy and get better, and those are all great things. But then it occurred to me recently that of course I wouldn't know that, because I'm a cisgender white male. The entire world has been designed for me. It is my playground. That's my game
Right.
outside the window, right?
Yeah.
Where from the time I was a child until the day I die, doors will open for me.
Mm,
And my wife and I and our kids were very, they see us and they're like, oh, a nice family, right? It's because
yep.
we live in a cisgender heteronormative imaginary, right? So of course, like, I would
Yeah.
look at games as being an escapist thing that people would escape into. So now my
Yep.
head is totally turned around, obviously, and I see
Mhm.
um, a new realm of privilege that I exist within, and how important games are to deconstructing that. And I find that really fascinating. I was wondering if you could, maybe your experience with
Sure.
students, do you have like similar experiences? Like, how, what are
Yeah.
these games, and how are they,
Totally.
what's going to happen in the future, like with this community connection that
Oh,
happens with games?
I'm I couldn't be more excited actually about where games as an art form are going. And what I've just seen in my time working in games, which honestly, I said I started as a photographer and then I was
Mhm.
doing some, other stuff. I was working in web design too. I didn't show any of the web design stuff I did, but I really only got into games kind of later in my life, far after I graduated college, like 10 years after I
Oh,
got out of
wow.
school.
Yeah.
And to me, it was because I found people that are kind of, as designers, uh accepting and open. I think game designers, because we're in this field where it's a new kind of a new, video games are relatively new as a medium,
Well,
and we're
yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
figure out like what can the medium do. I think
Yeah.
because of that, people are very willing to share how they made stuff and what their different design methods are. um, and it's a very open community, and you can find your people in it. Not everybody. I mean, I have to say, going to big game conferences, the big one every year is coming up. It's in March in San Francisco. It's called the Game Developers Conference.
Yeah.
There, it's a sea of white guys for the most part, but
Yeah.
it's changing. Over the
Yeah.
last years, it's changed so much for the better. And part of that is because the game industry went through a process of trauma through Gamergate. And I don't know if anyone
Yeah.
remembers Gamergate, but it was a time when female LGBTQ, brown and Black game designers were getting targeted by mobs of online
Yeah.
trolls, essentially. And, those online trolls, in a large part, were mostly white and male, and they were
Yeah.
concerned that games were going to be about different types of people and experiences. They didn't want all games to get, woke, so to speak, to use today's
Right.
language.
Yeah.
But what happened, what I really liked about, I mean, I hated that time. It was scary for
Yeah.
everybody. Um, but what ended up happening is that the game design community rallied together, and game designers defended their, minority or sort of, underrepresented colleagues. And
Yeah.
now it's really understood that for games to grow, we have to have designers and makers from all kinds of backgrounds. And, I think that that's a really great thing. I will
Yeah.
say the community I most identify with is more of the indie game community rather than the AAA, Call of
Yeah.
Duty kind of
Rockstar.
games, or
Yeah.
AAA, yeah, AAA games.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I'm a little bit more aligned with and kind of feel comfortable within the indie game community, but part of that's just because I'm a weird art kid and I like the weird art stuff. But another part of that is that there is a great deal of openness to other points of view, I think, in that
Yeah.
community.
Okay, so this other idea of openness, something else occurred to me. You were talking about Chat GPT and the AI that you use in your game.
Yeah.
Um, it and then that all sort of like always, especially with AI, any kind of discussion of AI conjures up the idea of emergence in
Yeah,
games. And I was hoping like, there's a couple of things about that. I was hoping just to have like a blanket definition of emergence for everyone
sure.
that we could talk about, but also the thing that I understand about emergence is that it really, from a design standpoint, it requires open systems and variable, variations and user play, right? It kind of
Yeah.
requires user choices that then emerge from which emerges larger, behaviors. That, and it kind
Yeah.
of strikes me as the LGBTQ community already kind of operates on that mode where there's fluidity
Mhm.
in choices um and there isn't really it's not on rails the way that, say, like a heteronormative society kind of requires of us, but it's
Yeah.
much more open. And is it much more, as a result, much more open to emergence, and therefore how does that relate to gaming? It's a big question. It's kind of like ill-formed,
Oh,
but do you kind
I,
of understand what I'm
it's
saying?
no, I mean, I think it's a cool question to think about, because, emergence, I'll give you a good example. Emergence
Sure.
is something that comes from fairly simple rules and is behavior or dynamics that are unexpected.
Yeah.
So you mentioned poker earlier. Um,
Yeah.
in, in poker, if you read the rules of poker, first of all, it's really boring reading game rules, and
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
interesting. But
Yeah.
if you read the rules of poker, it's pretty simple. There's different varieties. Texas No Hold'em is one that I play with a group every couple of weeks. And with that game, there's just like a turn order, and then it's what suit or what kind of hands beat other hands. It's so simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nothing in the rules of poker describe bluffing.
Right.
But bluffing is an emergent behavior that
Yeah.
comes out of a strategic approach to that game. So bluffing is basically when you pretend you've got a better hand than you might have, and you bet
Yeah.
that way. And it's a really interesting thing because the game designers of poker, now we don't know who they are. We know that it emerged in the South, in the steamships, the version that we play now.
Yeah.
Um, gambling steamboats, basically.
Yeah.
Um, but the designer of that game didn't necessarily design bluffing, but we know that that's a
No.
big part of the gameplay and the experience. So when
Yeah.
you talk about experiences, first of all, the question is who designs the rules,
Yeah.
and then when you design those rules, you're not going to really be able to completely constrain what people do with those rules. They're going to approach those rules with their own strategies. And when we talk about games now, strategies, if you fail at poker, well, unless you're betting big money, it doesn't hurt that bad. But if you fail at
Right.
certain things in life, it's scary, right? It's like your means of survival. You've got to get a
Yeah.
job and you're at work, and there's all kinds of stuff. So I think the rules are created by those in power, right? They create emergent effects that are things like inequality, but we all
Mhm.
develop different strategies to deal with that. And I think ultimately we need to change the rules. I think that, life is a
Yeah.
badly designed game. It's also designed by whoever gets to make those rules.
Yeah.
But I think that, when you think about identity and experience and what you have access to, you're going to probably play the game differently than other folks who might have privilege and only be kind of, the rules are for them, and they're going to do the
Yeah.
thing where they get married and have children and do all the kind of life things that are kind of
Yeah.
built in this norm.
I think I mean, that's just fascinating to me. And then more specifically about Chat GPT and other AI, there's a
Yeah.
lot of opportunity there. I mean, the whole thing is emergent by definition in some ways that, I mean, I don't assume that the code for Chat GPT is simple and based on simple rules, but the
Mm-hmm.
inputs are simple. I mean, what's
Mm-hmm.
required of us is simple, and what comes out of it feels emergent. Would that be accurate to say? Like, is AI
Oh
kind of
yeah.
emergent? Okay.
Yeah.
Because
And Dorothy just posted, I remember you teaching us about the value of random moment or entity in games to push us from the expected and offer surprise. That's actually a big thing in games, right? Like random, like when you're dealt a hand in poker, you don't know what you're going to get. You're always, and with GPT, the same is true. You can, train a model on certain data or fine tune a model, but actually the code is really, I've never even seen the code, David. I know how to do certain things with the model, but the models themselves are so complex and so layered that it's really, you can't even trace what happens. They're called a black box. So basically, you've got this box, you've got the inputs and you've got the outputs.
Yeah, it's modular code, basically.
Yeah, you can look at those, but you can't look inside that black box. So I think by making games, I mean, the reason I made this game is so that we could play with these technologies and get to understand them better. But it's also a comment on the fact that there is no real intelligence in machine learning. It's all about probabilities and a little bit of randomness. And you learn that when you play with these models. I mean, you could just play with Chat GPT and learn a little bit of that. But I think that we always need to be interrogating the systems that underlie so much of our life. And actually, these machine learning models are used for a variety of things, including deciding if people get to go on parole from prison, like serious life-changing things. And unfortunately, these models are only as good as the data you train them on. And that data is typically biased. So we've got to be aware of it, and we've got to understand it. And I think games are a low stakes way to learn these things.
Well, that's another thing I was going to ask you about is that, well, you made the point that games can really digest much more complex systems and frankly boring in some cases, like the electoral. I mean, I love the electoral college. I love discussions about it, but I'm like a politics junkie, right? So I would, but most people don't care at all. But it makes things like that it turns them into engaging experiences. That's what's so great about games, right? And you, in some of your work, you were saying how you went to different places around the world to play more localized games. And I was wondering if, did you see and notice commonalities between games from around the world that, or is there something there, like how we could do comparative literature, for example? Is there comparative gaming, and does it reveal anything about cultures? Humans,
what I'll say, I mean, this is a pretty broad thing, but everybody plays games. Everybody remembers and learns games that they have played since they were kids. And not only that, so, okay, that's obvious, right? Like, I don't know of any place in the world where games haven't been something that humans do. But the other interesting thing that, can be easily discovered just by even reflecting on your own life is that we also understand how to make them. Because when we're kids and we're playing, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh, we're just tossing the ball back and forth. Let's see now if we can close our eyes and catch the ball, or whatever it might be. You might add some kind of arbitrary constraint, but what that really is designing a rule. It's designing a way to play. And so everybody's a game designer, we all learn it when we're kids. And that is one thing that I really, the work with the Red Cross was about co-designing. So it was about these simple rules that we can change. And I really, I think that creates a sense of empowerment, that if you can change the rules in a game and see what kind of things emerge, that emergence, then we can also test and pilot new rules in society, maybe, and see what emerges there, and include everyone in that process, because people understand from a very early age what kind of rules are fun, what kind of rules enable multiple inclusive strategies, and what kind of rules exclude. So, when you're playing with your little brother or sister and they're younger than you, they don't understand everything, you change the rules so that they can play, or you give them a little advantage, right? And I think in life, we have to be a little bit more empathetic, like when we were kids.
Yeah, that's interesting. That it makes me think of another question, which is it's a challenge. It's like a challenge to you. How
Yeah.
can games? My understanding of games, you know, both from like just my intrinsic not understanding of them, but also having read about them in game studies, is that there are a few like significant attributes about games, right? They have rules, right? They
Mm-hmm.
have victory conditions, like they have to have some kind of
Mm-hmm.
victory condition, but also
Or
they're close,
feedback as to how
or
you're
yeah,
doing. Yeah.
some kind
Mhm.
of feedback. And then of course good games have play in them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But like even chess, which doesn't really have a lot of play, has a lot of strategy, right? Which is
Oh yeah.
that's a kind of play, right? Or it's
Mm-hmm.
related. They occupy similar space. But the other thing that I've read about games is that they are closed systems. So it's like they
Yeah.
don't have a connection. What happens in the environment of the game system stays in the environment of the game system. So for example,
Mm-hmm.
you could take like a really culturally loaded game like baseball. There's an
Yeah.
entire culture that exists outside the game, right?
Right.
Obviously, and whole
Mhm.
economies are based on this. There's a whole culture that exists outside of baseball in the United States, but the game itself starts. There are
Mhm.
9 innings. If it goes into overtime, there
Yep.
are more, and then the game ends, and there's a winner and a loser, and that's it. You're done. Then you move on to the
Yeah.
next game.
Mhm.
So in
Mhm.
some ways, the beauty of games is that they're non-committal, right?
Right.
They're I think that, and this is the consensus. Unfortunately, perhaps the consensus view of games is that they're not serious.
Right.
They
Mhm.
have no import on importance to real life. So my
Mhm.
question to you is like, if that's the case, if that is true, or is it true? But
Yeah.
if we assume it's true, how can games really have a chance at affecting change if they're
Sure.
seen as something that aren't they're closed systems that aren't serious? They don't have import on our daily life. It's a
Yeah. I
challenging
mean,
question. I'm challenging you to answer me.
no, I love this question because it kind of gets at the heart of everything that I've tried to do with games. And why would you make a game about the Electoral College if you didn't think that it would at least help people understand a system that just
Yeah,
feels really foreign and is hard to wrap your head around? And
yeah,
um, so to me, I think that, when people say that, and actually there are two dead white men who kind of kick off the game studies movement. One is Johann Huizinga, who
hmm
talked about play and culture, and also Roger Caillois, who wrote that games have to be inconsequential.
yeah.
Um,
That's where I got
and
that from. Yeah,
yeah, and I think they're wrong. I think that okay, on one level, right? If we play a game, if I win the game or you win the game, we're still going to be friends, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that after we're done,
yeah,
uh, I get some special privilege over you, David, or
right,
like,
right,
it's like
right.
we understand. We on a certain level, we do encapsulate our game experience that way and
Yeah,
separate it from everyday life. But on the other hand, before we played a game, we might not have known each other that well. Maybe
mm,
we learned more about each other and who we are and what kind of play we bring to things. And we've bonded a little bit. We can talk about that. So when you talk about stories in games, there's stories in video games, right? They have
yeah,
characters and dialogue, kind of like Hollywood movies, but with interactive elements. But then there's also the stories we tell about the games that we've played. So that
right.
baseball game, or a pickup game of one versus one basketball, we're going to talk about that, and we're going to say, "Oh my God, do you remember that time?" Um,
Yeah,
and create shared experiences, which I think are really important in society. And they also establish fairness. Like apparently, it's supposed to be fair. Although, athletic games, certain people are in better
right.
shape to play than others.
Yeah,
But I think that the whole idea that games are not serious is wrong. It
yeah,
in a way, I think though, because games aren't taken seriously in society, we can do so much more with them. We can kind of talk about radical ideas. We can create
yeah,
utopian
yeah.
worlds and explore them, and not make a lot of people mad. So, there's ways
there's subversive in a way.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's cool. Yeah, that's like,
yeah,
it's
that
like
is
a
really
little hit.
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like
a little
you
mind
can inject it.
virus. Like, yeah, you can like inject.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I mean, it's similar, I think, in a way, and there's a long tradition now of this in graphic novels. Graphic
Mhm.
novels, I mean, had never. I mean, in the 40s and 50s, they were literally children's diversions, right? And then, but
Yeah.
that, of course, raised an entire generation of people who took
Mhm.
those characters and those stories seriously. And now, of course, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and then whatever DC has, those are multi-billion-dollar industries, and we're all, well, not me, but a lot of people are
Mhm.
watching they're consuming those stories. Um,
Yeah.
but graphic novels have also, there are things like Fun Home, like, Alison Bechdel,
Yeah.
and Mouse, by
Mhm.
Art Spiegelman. I mean, these are really
Yeah.
serious subjects that they're dealing with, but in a medium that feels non-committal, or sort of like fun, and
Right.
uh, so I think
Well,
I totally
Mouse
agree
is,
with you.
yeah,
Well, no,
Mouse is,
Mouse is not fun, but it's in
well,
the
no, no. Yeah,
yeah,
if you don't know Mouse is a comic about the Holocaust, and it's told
yeah.
through mice, characters who are mice. And that it's been banned in a bunch of different
Hmm.
states. It's not
Yep.
allowed in libraries because it does address these serious issues.
Yep.
And so I
Yep.
do think we're in a dangerous moment in culture where, you know, even though comics might not have been taken seriously,
Hmm.
uh, they are taken seriously to the extent that, our abilities to access them are being hindered by laws
Yep.
and fear, basically. So I think that we
Yeah,
have to
that's
really
true.
be vigilant. Um,
Yeah.
the thing about games that may be an advantage a little bit, but I don't know, is that, David, you were just saying you're Gen X, you don't play that many games. I think it's a
Mm.
generational thing too. I think that Gen Z spends more time playing games than they do on social media or watching TV or movies. So
Yeah.
they're important medium. And, I'm sure that we'll start to see certain games getting banned, but they do still fly a little bit under the radar at the moment because most people
Yeah.
don't really have a good literacy about games
I
still.
think that's what it is. I mean, and literacy is a good word for it, because, you know, Mouse and Fun Home and some other notable graphic novels are books, right? They're things that
Yeah.
would be in a library. I think in the 21st century, libraries are now just getting around to including games as part of their
Mm.
collections, right? As part of a cultural collection. And I think you're right. The irony here is, as game studies becomes a more serious and more prevalent topic, academic
Yeah.
topic, you're probably right. Like, it's probably going to get to the point where, and there's been a lot of discussion about games historically as like fomenting violence and sexism and stuff like that.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
I think you're right. Those same canards are going to come out and emerge in the culture war that's we're currently embroiled in, and games will be that, they will
But
pop into the discussion.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you're probably right, and that's unfortunate. But I also feel like, again, back to the idea of where does queerness reside in a game? It resides in multiple places. It might reside in the
Yeah.
stories and characters. It might
Yeah.
reside in the gameplay itself, that
Yeah.
it maybe doesn't promote the hero story, which so many video games do, but
Yeah.
instead promotes the story from a perspective of someone who is struggling or
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
who's finding their own way through a
Yeah.
system. So there's that. And then there's
That's
also
interesting.
how we as players choose to play and form community around the games. And so there's so many ways to
Wow.
connect, you know, LGBTQ communities,
Yeah.
underrepresented through games, that I really have I have optimism about the the
Well,
medium.
if you have optimism about the medium, then I will as well, because that,
Yeah.
I mean, that really does open up an entirely new way of looking at it. I think we could probably end it there. That's a brilliant
Yeah.
place to end. Thank you so much, Colleen. This has been amazing. We could have talked for
Oh
4 more hours.
and I'm sorry I didn't get to chat too much with the audience, but what I'll say is that you can easily find me. I am Colleen Macklin on Twitter and just about every other platform. So say
Yeah.
hey, I'm happy to chat more.
Thank you so much, Colleen. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, David. This is really wonderful. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you, everybody. All right, everyone, have a good day, and see you next week, same bat time, same bat channel. All righty, goodbye, everybody.